Hi, I'm Madeline James, and today I wanted to talk about taking my first draft and creating a revision guide to get started on my first set of developmental edits. So a quick disclaimer, this is not a list of what to look for and how to find issues developmentally, and this is not a guide on how to actually do a developmental edit. There's a video by Abby Emmons that I really like that I'll link below. But what this is really just a guide on the process that I went through from first draft to having a revision guide. It's a very overwhelming process, I found, and it's really easy to just kind of not know where to really get started, feel kind of overwhelmed, not know how to kind of get things structured and organized in a way that you can actually get started. So I'm hoping that this can help kind of give you an idea of how I overcame all that overwhelming list of things that are horrible and wrong with your book to have a game plan and get started. So obviously the first step is you need to have a completed first draft. And it's okay if there's still like some notes. You don't need to have gone back and done anything after finishing. You just need to have written it so that you have it all there. I finished the first draft for my, my Blood Magic novel at the very end of July. So August 1st, I was ready for the next step. As I was writing my first draft, instead of going back and making big changes when I decided I wanted to kind of go in a different direction with the plot or with a character or something like that, I kept a list. So I had, I think it was like 2 or 3 pages of just like, ooh, I'm changing what this is called, or ooh, I'm going to kind of go this way with this character, stuff like that. Sort of like revision notes, but as I was writing, once I finished my first draft, I really wanted to take a break, a good sizable break, and I've seen this recommended in a lot of different places and a lot of different videos to take some time to kind of separate yourself from what you've written to kind of get a clear point of view so that when you go back and read your novel, you're able to see it with fresher eyes. So I was originally planning on taking about a month off, but I ended up taking about a month and a half. So August 1st to mid-September, I took this break. And then the other thing that I did during this break was I started working on my next writing project. And the reason I kind of did it this way was because I'm hoping to query. So if I start querying in about a year, which is my goal for my Blood Magic project, and I give it about a year of querying before I kind of give up, maybe decide that book, maybe I need to shelf for now and start querying my next project. I need to have actually written that project. So during my break, I planned and outlined that new writing project, which was really fun to kind of take a step back. I also did a lot of research during that stage on novel structure, different plot arcs, character development, stuff like that, because I was about to start a new project. And I've actually been able to use a lot of that going into these revising processes, so it's definitely been beneficial for a lot of different reasons. The other thing that happened during this break, and I think this is optional, I really enjoyed it, and I'll do it again, but I actually had an alpha reader read my book, and obviously I would only do this if you have someone that can read your book that is used to seeing things in a really rough format and are okay being honest with you, because your first draft is probably pretty awful. So whoever you kind of open yourself up to and get vulnerable with to let them see like the completely raw version of your book has to be kind of special. So that's actually my husband doing that for me. So he read my entire first book. I asked him to make more developmental comments. So things like, if there's a place where it feels really rushed or really slow, or he's just bored or something happens and he's like, I have no idea how this happened, like nothing led up to this. This just came out of nowhere, or inconsistencies, plot holes, things where he was like, this was not satisfying, or I was really amped up for this to happen, but it didn't. Stuff like that. So he's kind of my alpha reader, as I'm calling it. So during that month, he had my book and was going through and making those comments for me. Part of the reason why I ended up waiting a month and a half, because it took him that long to finish reading it. He is a slow reader. So once I was ready to pick my book up after my break and look at it with fresh eyes, I went ahead and did a read-through. And the most important parts of this are to not change anything and to not get too distracted by maybe mechanical or stylistic issues. So I actually exported my manuscript from Scrivener and sent it to my Kindle so that I could read it in there, because you can't edit in Kindle. It was great. So I read through my entire book. I wrote this down. It took me about 2 weeks to kind of do it slowly, kind of think about things as I went. And because my husband had already read my book, because he was my alpha reader, I could kind of talk things through with him. I hadn't looked at his comments yet. But yeah, I was mostly making developmental comments on things that I thought needed to change, things where I thought it was boring, stuff like that, beyond what I already had kind of planned that I wanted to change while I was writing. And I did this at the book level, and I did this at the chapter level, and then at the very end I kind of did like okay, I've read my whole book. What could really make this more powerful? Like, what am I really trying to do with this? And what do I need to do to accomplish that goal, I guess? So at that point, I had 3 sets of notes. I had my husband's developmental comments, I had my notes from when I was writing on things I wanted to change, and I had all of my developmental comments from doing my read-through. So that brings us to the next stage, which is compiling all your revision notes. This only took me a day. It doesn't take that long to do, but basically I went through, and my husband was actually reading a physical copy of my book, so I had to go through and flip through everything, and I kind of highlighted, let's see if I can find something, but I highlighted everything that was actually a developmental edit because he couldn't help himself and made a lot of other kinds of edits, which is fine. I'll probably look at this as I actually go through and edit, but let's see. So he had just big pages of notes, and then I highlighted anything within there that was a developmental kind of overarching comment, and I moved those to a document along with all of my writing notes and all of my read-through developmental comments, and I kind of organized into 3 sections. So I had overall notes, so overarching, or it's not about a specific character, not about a specific chapter kind of note. And then I had individual by character notes and then individual by chapter notes. My book is multi-POV, so you might not need to have multiple sections in the character part, but I did. So then I was not originally planning on doing this next step until later, and I think it's probably technically optional. You may already have this. But as I was writing and outlining, my outline kind of became giant. It was like a 40-page document, I think, and I had it online and in all these different places, and as I was writing, I added some scenes or changed some things, so it didn't perfectly reflect that outline that I had before. So what I did here, and I'd already kind of started creating my revision guide and had to go back to this, I kind of reverse created an outline. So I went through my book and kind of just documented like, okay, for chapter 1, scene 1 is this, and kept it short and simple, just like a sentence. Anything major that happened, kind of give me an idea of who was there, where they were, what happened, any major plot points, that sort of a thing. So once I had that sort of outline and list of scenes, it would give me a really good idea of where I needed to actually make changes. Because if you have a developmental note saying, there's no basis for this thing this person did with their magic, or for this thing that happened, you need to add something where this happens, right? It's really helpful if you have that kind of outline so you can go back and be like, okay, well, these are those characters' scenes. This is a good place to put that, and you just move that note up there so that it's where you're going to need it. So that was very important stage. Definitely recommended if you don't already have something that'll kind of work for this. Creating that outline in reverse took me about 4 days to do. And keep in mind that a day for me is like hour, maybe 2 tops. I have small children. So you could probably do it in 1 day if you had a decent chunk of time to devote to it, or if your book isn't as long as mine. Mine is like 130,000 words, so yours might be shorter and quicker. So the next step is to take all of those notes on your first draft, those, developmental overarching notes, and turn them into a revision guide. And this does not need to have every tiny little fix detailed out and exactly how you're going to fix it. And this may also be a question of whether or not you're more of a pantser or more of a plotter. I kind of went in the middle, maybe slightly leaning towards being more organized with it, because I am a very big plotter. I need everything very organized. So I would do this kind of linearly and kind of start at the top. So you have your overarching comments that may not actually end up being like overarching revisions. They're just comments that you didn't know what character or what chapter to kind of assign them to. So one of my overarching comments, I guess, was that magic was not as dominant of a presence in my book as it really should be, given how important it is to the plot and the individual character plots and some of the subplots. So I kind of thought about that. I kind of like started brainstorming on a separate piece of paper, like how am I going to add more magic into the story? So kind of as I figured out what scenes or where I wanted to add those, I went down into the chapter outline and I added little comments for those, like make sure you mention this, add scene, blah, have this person use magic to solve this problem instead of whatever they're currently using. So I went through all of those overarching ones and did that if I could move them, or I kind of came up with ways that I wanted to solve them and ideas. There's a few that I kind of left vague that I kind of wanted to figure out as I was writing, but for the most part I kind of came up with a plan. And I still had a few left up there that were just things that I needed to fix throughout the entire book. And for me, those are things like my dialogue got a lot better as I was writing the first draft. The dialogue in the last few chapters is okay. Dialogue at the beginning is atrocious and cringeworthy. So dialogue is a big thing that I need to look at the entire time. I also need to describe more of my setting. I have a tendency to have like random scenes really well described, and then really important settings are never actually described. So that's something I want to fix. And then I don't have a ton of descriptions of my tertiary characters, like what they look like. So I need to go through and add that kind of just throughout the entire book. Next, I moved on to the by character comments. And again, most of these ended up moving lower into the chapter section because the solutions were to add things at the chapter level. There were a few things that needed to be fixed. So there's a couple of characters where I was like, as I was writing, I kind of changed the direction I was going with who they were, kind of their individual voice in their chapters. And so I had a note to kind of go back through the entire beginning, all of their early chapters, and kind of make it consistent with that later character personality voice. Once you get down to the chapter level, a lot of that stuff is going to be moving things around. You may need to actually move some of your scenes or move some of your chapters or do more structural things like that. I went ahead and I just did this. I was doing this in Google Docs, so I kept it there. If I go through and do another developmental pass like this, where I'm thinking I'm going to have a lot of structural changes, I will probably do, I can't remember her name. I'll link it below or caption it or something, but there's a writer who has a really, really detailed revision process. And for this stage, what they kind of do is they have index cards with the scene information, and then they have like color-coded sticky notes of changes they want to make on those. And that makes it kind of easier to kind of move it around and make things like that without getting confused by just a linear document. So you could do something like that if you think that's necessary or, fun. So I'm creating another document for my actual, by chapter guide, my real revision guide, and I'm going to put the overarching comments at the beginning of every single chapter. I'm going to put the kind of overarching by character comments or fixes at the beginning of every chapter that, that character is either the main POV or one of the more dominant POVs in that chapter, and kind of make sure I document, which character it is. And then I can just move the chapter comments to, the relevant chapters. And that way I only have this bit that I need to look at for every chapter. I have the overarching, the character, and the stuff that's specific for that chapter, and I don't need to scroll around and look at stuff because that's how you forget things. Or at least that's how I forget things, because my mind is a black hole, and if something's not written down, it is like it never existed in the first place. So the last step of kind of how I'm getting to a revision guide, and this is optional, I think it kind of depends on you, where your draft is, and what you kind of think you need to do. But I wanted to make some sort of mini reference guides for some of the more overarching things that I need to fix. So I'm going to do this for two things. I'm doing this for setting, because I have a lot of scenes that I don't describe really well. So this will be easier if I just make a list of all these settings, kind of provide like maybe a couple sentences description, maybe a paragraph of just how it would look. And I'll describe it different ways when I'm actually like writing it, but just kind of so I have something consistent to kind of go with. And then I'm going to do this for my tertiary characters too. I don't think I'll fully flesh this out. I think I'll kind of add to it as I'm going, but this way I have notes that I'm consistent. If I describe a character one way in chapter 2, when they reappear in chapter 9, I want to make sure my descriptions are consistent so that I don't create more problems to fix later. So I'm just putting those in documents with all those different notes, and that's going to be something that I'll kind of reference to. So I would only do this for really important things or really dominant, easy to kind of work in things so that you're not confusing yourself with having a ton of different places to look as you're doing these revisions. But at the end of this, I have a full revision guide, and it has all the different things I need to change, and I can sit down and start going through chapter by chapter and fixing everything, and it's so much less overwhelming. Like, I'm going to be completely honest, at some of the earlier stages in this, like especially when I was going from notes to guide, I really had to keep reminding myself to just look at one thing at a time, one bullet, one little note, figure out what you're going to do for that, move it in, go to the next one, and just keep working like that and not get overwhelmed by the sheer volume of all the different issues and things I want to fix and stuff like that. This really helped me kind of stay focused and actually get it done and not get scared. When I get overwhelmed, I tend to just not do anything, which is great. Yeah. So not counting the break I took, but from actually finishing my first draft, going through, doing my reread, compiling my notes, creating my guides, that process was, let me see, maybe 5 weeks. You could probably do it in a month, maybe less if you have more free time than I do. So now that I have all my revisions guides, I'm going to actually sit down and I'm going to start going through chapter by chapter and making these edits and do that first developmental pass, which I'm hoping I can do in a month. We'll see. And then I'm probably going to do this again and do it a bit more structured. I think I'll actually do the whole sticky note method of every single scene and chapter, kind of mapping it out, really looking at the story structure now that I've kind of spent some time doing a lot more research on that and learning about beats and stuff like that. Especially because this is my first time doing this for like a large scale epic fantasy novel. You know, I really want to make sure that I'm not getting sidetracked as I go through and do this first edit. I want to just focus on what's in my revision guide, and if there's other issues, I'll keep a separate list for notes of what I want to fix in the next pass. And, you know, if I have to keep doing this a few times until I get everything, then great. And then I'll move on to the next type of editing. But I think it's really important to get all these large-scale things down before you really start working on, like, mechanical or stylistic edits, at least in my opinion. If you're trying to finish your first draft or just finished it and are getting started on revisions, let me know in the comments below and tell me what your game plan is and what you're doing. All writers are really different and have different processes, and what works for one person isn't really going to work just out of the box for another person. So I'd love to know what you're doing, and I'll see you next time.